Walt, this week it was GTC in the Valley. And what does Jensen do? He gives a speech, hold courts, and you get the famous NVIDIA bounce. While Jensen was busy holding court in the Valley, Uber had some news of their own. They got a new Robotaxi partner, and our good friends over at Waymo, they released some interesting safety data, which we'll get into a little bit later. But let's start with the news of the week, GTC. What did you uncover?
Well, Grayson, I think I deserve a clappy hat for this one because I think we talked about this on last week's podcast, previewing GTC and expecting autonomy announcements specifically with Uber and that would drive Uber stock. And sure enough, it did. We'll get to that later. But before we even go into the NVIDIA news, let's try and dissect the alphabet soup of terms that they're using. You've got Thor they're talking about compute. Hyperion, which I thought was the sensor stack, but maybe it means the full driver. Alpamayo, which I thought was training, but again, Jensen seems to be using it interchangeably with now, the kind of AV stack. You got full stack, you got half stack, you got open stack. I'm a bit lost in all of the words, and I think even Jensen, when he was, on the All In podcast, was getting tripped up on describing some of this stuff.
Well, first and foremost, happy clap for you. So there you go. You got the clap, not the open claw. Maybe at some point we'll get the open claw happen. Right now we have the happy cat clap. Well, really what we need, and don't laugh, it's almost that you need a guide to NVIDIA. Hyperion means this. Alpamayo means this. And basically, do we need the NVIDIA chart to truly understand what all these things mean? Because it seems to me, from reading the press releases and going through the technical blogs, that there is a lot of technical overlap between all these various different services and functions and technologies that NVIDIA is offering to the market.
I agree. It's confusing, and I swear that they've described some of these things differently. I don't have anything to back it up in the moment. Bottom line is, I think they want to be full stack, right? And as a result, that really dates back to CES. Like Uber stock first moved on them talking about effectively, and when I say full stack, meaning competing with other autonomy providers, whether it's Waymo or Nuro or Wave, maybe more specifically than Nuro and Wave. Those full stack companies are trying to sign up OEMs, just like I think NVIDIA is trying to sign. And by the way, for longtime listeners of this podcast, we talked about NVIDIA wanting to be full stack well before CES. In fact, I think we speculated on maybe that they want to jumpstart into this area because of doing acquisitions. And I think, you put the Grayson inspector hat on and, you I think, identified a document that showed that they actually looked at purchasing one of these companies.
Yes, there was a court document from the Delaware Chancery Court where NVIDIA technically didn't look at purchasing. They looked at entering into a licensing deal with Zoox for a $100 million licensing deal where NVIDIA would inject $100 million into Zoox in exchange for the exclusive rights to license the technology. However, in the court documents, there was a very clear caveat, not acquire, pure licensing injection there. This was the Wave versus Zoox lawsuit, which is still currently going on. This is prior to the Amazon acquisition in 2020. But to me, interesting sign that they wanted to exclusively license that technology. And in the court documents, it says that, end quote, NVIDIA wanted to use this as a showcase for their technology. So to me, based on these court filings, based on what we've seen at GTC in the Valley, what we saw in GTC in DC, NVIDIA has very big ambitions, but how big are those ambitions? Because on the All In podcast, Jensen said they don't want to build the car, they want to enable it. And let's roll that clip and get your commentary on it.
We believe that everything that moves will be autonomous, completely or partly, someday. Number one. Number two, we don't want to build self-driving cars, but we want to enable every car company in the world to build self-driving cars. And so we built all three computers, the training computer, the simulation computer, the evaluation computer, as well as the car computer. We developed the world's safest driving operating system. We also created the world's first reasoning autonomous vehicle so that it could decompose complicated scenarios into simpler scenarios that it knows how to navigate through, just like us, reasoning systems. And so that reasoning system, called Alpamayo, has enabled us to achieve incredible results. We open this, we vertical optimization, we horizontally innovate, and we let everybody decide, do you want to buy one computer from us? In the case of Elon and Tesla, they buy our training computers. Do they want to buy our training computer and our simulation computers? Or do you want to let us work with us to do all three and even put the car computer in your car? So our attitude is we want to solve the problem. We're not the solution provider. And we're delighted however you work with us.
So the words that kind of pop out to me is we are not the solutions provider. So I don't know what he defines as solution provider. Is he talking about Uber? Is he talking about the OEM? Is he talking about like Nuro as the solutions provider? So like that answer to the question, and I think Jason did a great job setting him up, saying like, hey, and this was, by the way, the narrative that came out of CES, which was like, NVIDIA can be the Android, in competition with iOS, which is iOS would be Waymo or Tesla. So if they're the Android, then they're like the third player, and all these other guys, I guess, go away in that theory. And like, I don't think Jensen really took the bait on that based on that clip that we just played.
It's interesting. So I don't mean to go back to Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't mean to get into the weeds, but how do you define the solutions provider when you're providing the compute, you're providing some of the self-driving technology, and yet you state that you want to enable self-driving, you don't want to own the vehicle? I just think that I don't want to sound like the AP style guy, but we need references for what all these terms mean.
Look, the bottom line is, let's just put all the words aside. Let's go back to what we've said on this podcast for, again, well before CES. We think they want to be the full stack provider. We think they want to sell to OEMs. They're obviously showing videos with Mercedes and talking about other OEMs. You don't hear any mention, of Nuro or Wave, which are partners of NVIDIA, in that those companies use their compute and none of this other stuff, none of the sensor stacks or the drivers. So let's just put all that aside, even though there's, kind of a jumble of terms. And I think, you can, again, decide for yourself after listening to that Jensen quote what you think all that meant. We're going to assume that they are going forward and going to try and sign up OEMs. And I think the implication then for these other companies, these many, many companies that Uber has partnered with, is it has to make it more challenging for them to raise additional capital. So I think to a certain extent, while Uber wants this fragmentation by endorsing, and kind of pushing to the forefront NVIDIA, it's going to make it harder for competition to drive, competitive, innovation across these multiple players, just because it's going to challenge financing.
It is. And if you look at the numbers, the NVIDIA chips are very, very expensive. And the question is, at some point, another chip provider could compete with them. We're seeing moves out of Qualcomm. We could see custom fabs, what we're seeing with Tesla and Rivian. So there's competition on the horizon.
Let's move on to where we think that NVIDIA is compared to, Nuro and Wave and some of the others. We had a video as evidence. Jensen or NVIDIA put it up there with Jensen in a Mercedes with another NVIDIA employee. And, obviously CEO of the company, and he's like very excited. He's like, oh, the car went into the left lane and went into the right lane. I'm like, okay, I've done that for months, years, whatever it is, on my Tesla FSD, and obviously the many other cars that are out there. And it's like, I don't know why this was so exciting. This looked like just a level 2 implementation in that Mercedes.
It clearly looked like a level 2. I would compare it to GM's Super Cruise, Ford's Blue Cruise, Tesla's original autopilot. The technology seemed very clear there. What it looked like to me, and I'm not an engineer, but it looked very clearly like it was an L2 system. And on the All In podcast, Jensen made a very interesting remark when Jason, who asked a really great question, asked Jensen about what is the role of the driver, where do drivers go? And then Jensen offered this remark of how the car will drive itself. It'll be an L4 car in that case, and the chauffeur will sit behind the wheel. But I put on my regulatory hat. You're opening up a massive liability if that is indeed the case. But if you're going to operate an L2 service, that's 100% correct. If you're going to operate as an L4 service, the liability, the benefits of L4 go away because legally, the way that the laws are written today, the individual sitting behind the wheel is legally responsible for all interactions. When you're at L4 legally and there is no steering wheel, no pedals, We don't know who's responsible, but we do know right now, as the way that the laws are written, it will not be the passenger or the individuals riding in those vehicles. So again, it goes back to, I'm going to call it the great NVIDIA chart of terms.
Yeah, and look, and the bottom line is the business case here is to not have anyone, behind the wheel, in the passenger seat. I mean, obviously we're going through the same issue with Tesla and their launch. They have a driver now in the passenger seat, and obviously we took rides where there's no one in the car. So these are all just kind of steps along the way. And the process is, again, them being at level 2, similar to, I think, Wave in some of their OEM relationships, but it wasn't, one of the big companies that was going after the OEMs, again, with level 2, Mobileye. And yet Mobileye, I don't think was now down on this announcement. It would seem to me like they would get more impacted than anyone if you're effectively having someone like NVIDIA coming in and competing to deliver level 2 service, at least initially, with a path to level 4, which again is the Mobileye game plan as well.
It is. I think this is my perspective, that there's a lot of disconnect in the market between reality of the technology. But NVIDIA, if you go on their website, you can see all the logos, or if you watch a Jensen presentation, I don't know the exact number, but they have a significant OEM relationship. And that relationship, that NVIDIA technology could easily be integrated on the 7-year cycles for L2. In theory, this is in theory, which would replace Mobileye if that's the route that they chose to go.
So look, at the end of the day, the keynote, the video, that's not the thing that was really that interesting. I mean, the new news was the announcement with Uber. I mean, they had a ton of announcements, as NVIDIA always does, but the Uber announcement, which pushed the stock up 5% plus, I think Lyft was also up a similar amount. We'll get to them later. And I think let's break this into 2 parts. You have this milestone, the first milestone, which they're saying by the first half of 2027, so that's about a year away from now, they're going to launch in San Fran and LA. So this is important, right? Because this is the near-term timeline. This is, effectively NVIDIA with whatever OEM, not announced, demonstrating that they can deliver what we believe to be the full stack. This is on Waymo's home turf. So we got signal on, what the relationship is like between Waymo and Uber. This was the thing. They're laying down the gauntlet, which I thought made it feel more real. I mean, who do you think the OEM is going to be, and what did you make of this first milestone?
I'm going to give who I think it is, and this is based on a press release. It will most likely be a Stellantis brand based on the press release. However, I will caveat and also say there was a company mentioned in the press release, Foxconn. Foxconn unsuccessfully did not acquire the Nissan plant in Japan, but Foxconn has the engineering resources to do it. So perhaps it could be Foxconn, but then you're going to have to go through the FMVSS and all the regulatory stuff to do that. So I'm going to give you a cop-out and say it's most likely a Stellantis brand. Which brand in Stellantis? I don't know, but most likely a Stellantis brand.
I mean, I didn't see anything in the press release that suggested that, so I have to go back and take another look. I mean, the fact that the Jensen's in a Mercedes, and that seems to be their high-profile, car, my guess is it's probably going to be that. And at the end of the day, I'm not even sure it matters, because when you say launch, I put my inspector hat on to try and determine what exactly does quote unquote a launch mean. And in the press release, I did see this in the press release. It said, quote, an operator-led launch before transitioning to fully driverless level 4 deployment. So this first half of 2027, to be clear, is not going to be a Waymo type thing where you've got cars, driving around with no one in there. To me, that means you have a safety driver. And that's, by definition, not level 4, whatever. Maybe it's a level 4 in terms of the technology, and it's just like, hey, the safety guy's there just to watch Aurora style. But there will be a safety driver there. And, so I checked with Uber. Uber's definition of the launch is it's commercially available on the app, which again, confirms kind of my view. Why? Because if you look at AV Ride in Dallas, or what May Mobility is going to be doing in Arlington, they will have safety drivers, and it will be available commercially on Uber's app. So I think that is what we should expect in the first half of 2027. What are your beliefs?
It will be a safety driver. It's the same thing that we saw in a press release a few weeks ago, that the Lucid launch with Nuro and Uber will be safety drivers. But the thing to watch in all of this, removing the safety drivers, is the ODD. How large is the service area? Is it running in complex urban areas? Is it running in suburbia areas? Is Uber and their partners going to have their Chandler moment? And when I say their Chandler moment, Waymo very famously launched whenever the Google self-driving car project in rural Arizona because the streets were wide, the infrastructure was good to learn the technology, and that did very well for Waymo. So I think that's something that we're going to have to watch, the service area and where inside of that service area or the geographical region that this is launched.
I got to give you credit because you've always been very consistent on pointing this out, and that's something I left out in the note that I wrote for our investors earlier in the week, the ODD. And you talked about this in Austin and have been consistently right. And yes, that's a big part of it, meaning that, like, what is the broad investor viewpoint of when NVIDIA says SF in LA? They're thinking probably what Waymo is delivering today. And the reality is, like, if it's, maybe all of San Francisco, maybe it's even less than that. Remember when Amazon launched Zoox? It was like a very small, even subset of San Francisco. So that will also be a part of it. Technically, is it a launch? Yeah, it'll be commercially available on the app, but like, where's it gonna actually go? So I think that's a great call out. And like, again, if you think about how investors react to this stock and the thing, I don't think they have that understanding. So when people end up going in the first half of 27 and checking this out, is their view going to be as positive in terms of how that positions Uber and NVIDIA, based on what they're delivering there? And then more importantly, like, shouldn't we get data points prior to that? Every other autonomy stack company we talk to, even prior to whatever the launch is, we or someone has been able to get into cars. And the only evidence that we have of anyone getting into an NVIDIA full stack car, I guess if they call it that, is this Mercedes. And all of that feedback, although generally positive, has pointed out the interventions and the fact that it's really just an level 2 type of experience.
I was 7-8 years ago. I was in one of the original NVIDIA drive vehicles. We did it in a parking lot. This is before we went to open roads. And it was marketed and built for an L4 system, but in all reality, it was operated in a level 2 system in a controlled environment. I have not been in the latest version of the vehicle. However, we do have multiple reports in YouTube videos, and I believe it might in talking about the interventions. And if I'm an investor or I'm an analyst, if I go out to San Francisco to experience this technology, I experience the NVIDIA technology. Okay, and then immediately I order the Waymo app. There's no driver in there. I mean, I'm just thinking about this. I don't run money, but that's like, wait a second, what am I missing here?
No, that's my point. And I think hopefully we'll get data points prior to that other than, the hand-selected media people that they've done. And I'm not, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I think those people did a great job at reviewing their experience in the Mercedes. Obviously, they were doing test rides at CES. And look, I'll throw it out there. I know we have got a good set of listeners. I'll fly anywhere to get into one of those cars, or anyone else that has an autonomy stack that they want me to try. Get on a plane, no matter how long the TSA lines are right now, to try it out. But again, those data points, I don't know, relative to what people are going to expect from NVIDIA, there may be a disconnect there.
I think there's a disconnect, but the question to you is, when the disconnect becomes a reality, how does the market react? They say, oh, that's less than 2% of the revenue. It's okay. They still sell GPUs and data centers, or how does the market react?
Well, this podcast, there is no investment advice on it by definition. But I think over the course of the year, there's going to be a lot of puts and takes in terms of, who's in the lead or not. And I think, look, I would expect NVIDIA to provide more OEMs in terms of the partnerships. I don't know what the various, connection will be with those OEMs. Waymo will do the same. Wave and Neuro will likely do the same. Find additional OEMs, expand existing relationships. So there's going to be that kind of back and forth. In the meantime, over at Waymo, there's going to be cranking out more and more cars, and Tesla, hopefully will finally lock down the software to start to ramp up their own volume of unsupervised cyber cabs and robotaxis. So I think there's just a lot of noise that we will see over the course of the year. But again, it's just where expectations are today.
I'll tell you what you and I saw at Giga was absolutely, absolutely impressive. And I have a whole newfound respect for manufacturing. And that makes me put on my inspector hat where I'm watching press releases, groundbreakings for factories. does an OEM spin up a robotaxi line for contract manufacturing? I think that's a sign that we need to watch over the next 12 to 18 months, because that'll be a really good indicator of how fast the technology is going to scale.
So speaking of the long term, there was another phase of the Uber press release with NVIDIA that talked about 28 markets by 28. Now, look, why 28 markets? That sounds very specific. It's pure marketing, right? If next year happened to be 2030, Uber and NVIDIA would have said 30 markets by 2030, right? So that is the number. Doesn't mean they can't get there. That's not the target. But there are, from what I can tell, and I've done the research on this, there's no specific OEMs tied to those 20 markets. There's no specific commitments. This is not necessarily a real roadmap. They're just saying, look, it's NVIDIA. We're comfortable with where their technology development is. We think they're going to hit this in the first half of 27, as we've talked about. They're going to sign more OEM relationships. Getting to 28 markets, seems likely. I don't know which OEM. They listed Hyundai, Kia, Stellantis, which you talked about earlier, BYD, Polestar, JLR. There's a list of OEMs. I don't know how many of them are going to actually go there. But again, now we're getting caught in this trap, which I've talked about with the truckers, of working with OEMs and expecting OEMs to move quickly to deliver products to the market. And we've seen the challenges that Waymo has had on that front.
Which raises the interesting question, what role does Magna play in all this? Magna is Waymo's contract manufacturer. Does Magna expand out and do other contract manufacturing? And let's not forget, for the audience, Magna manufactures some of the BMW vehicles as well, so they have great expertise.
Yeah, and any upfit company we would think is probably interesting right now. Obviously, the ideal is to have this integrated directly into the OEM's process. And if you think about NVIDIA, you would think it would be more likely not to have to upfit things. So when you're hitting 28, you would think that that's a result of a partnership. But again, it's March of 26. We know how OEMs move, which is slow. To expect them to deliver those types of products in any type of scale by 28, it's going to be a challenge. Hyundai is obviously at the forefront. You mentioned Stellantis and the relationship potentially with Foxconn. In terms of anyone else that gets added into the mix being part of that 28 timeframe, other than maybe, again, Mercedes, Hyundai, or Stellantis, hard to guess. And remember, this is international, right? So BYD and others could be part of it.
And then on the U.S. side, at least you have union issues, then you have retooling issues. And so the timelines are extremely aggressive unless you're going to look for foreign automakers to help accelerate that. And then you run into the tariff issue and the policy issues of bringing those vehicles into the United States.
So let's tie up the last thing here, which is Lyft, which is up also 5% of the news. They didn't have a specific announcement in terms of timelines. I don't think there's no specific OEM relationship that was brought into this. There was no video of a Lyft, a Lyft in a NVIDIA-powered vehicle. So when you put your inspector hat on, what was your takeaway from that release?
Not to be disrespectful, I'm a little confused. It seemed to me that it was a compute relationship. I reached out to Lyft for clarification. There is no vehicle involved in the deal, so that we can confirm. It seemed that it's a compute deal, but
a compute for what? For a car, or for how the platform is running? How their own, matching drivers to cars is running?
I'm going to go back to the great NVIDIA chart and say I'm confused. I don't know. I don't know.
Look, at the end of the day, I don't think there was anything really of note in that release. Why was it Lyft stock up? Again, if NVIDIA does become the Android, does effectively become a platform where multiple OEMs are out there, when these OEMs are not going to do exclusives with Uber only. So Lyft will benefit from the diversification and having more OEMs with autonomy. So if the market is optimistic that Waymo and Tesla are not going to run away from the market, that's going to benefit Lyft. My perspective on this is if I'm Lyft, I think I go the other way. If there's additional signal, which again, longtime Autonomy Markets listeners, we've been talking about the issues that exist potentially between Waymo and Uber. I think we were earlier than anyone on that, right? Even when people were saying, oh, Austin is going so great and it's going to expand. So if there's issues there, and Lyft maybe should spend more time accelerating the relationship with FlexDrive, and I think it's Nashville, right? Get that thing going. and maybe trying to become like the default choice, build a good layer of flex drive, which enables them to put the Waymo. So like if you have choices out in the market, that yes, obviously Waymo One app is probably going to dominate across all markets, but maybe Lyft becomes the preferred platform of choice. And maybe try and bear hug Waymo to the extent you can, and in the meantime, look, if things develop with some of these other players, then great. They can add those things onto their network as well. I'm sure Waymo is not going to lock them up on any exclusives in any markets.
I've said this before many times on this podcast and on the road to autonomy. I think flex drive is a strategic asset, apparently, in my opinion, an underappreciated asset for Lyft. And we have confirmation on the road to autonomy podcast where Jeremy Bird, head of operations, said they would explore the possibility of doing deals with flex drive without Lyft. And if all these vehicles are going to come online, and if the theory holds that you and I believe that some of these fleets will be owned by independent third-party operators, well, what do you want to do? You want demand. So that could benefit Lyft and say, okay, by the way, you can use flex drive if you put some of those vehicles on the Lyft network. It becomes a strategic asset for them as autonomy fractures and really truly scales.
So we have Uber's and Lyft's stock skyrocketing, right? Again, on this, I think, theory that I think Jason Calacanis describes very well, which is like becoming the Android. Like NVIDIA is the answer. So if you're like Uber, I mean, obviously you can't put all your eggs in one basket. They have prior relationships, but like if now NVIDIA is going to deliver first half of 27, 28 markets in 28, 2 days later you sign a deal with Rivian. Right? Rivian, out of the blue, doing everything on their own. I think they might be using NVIDIA compute. I have no idea. Maybe they're doing their own. But out of the blue, you tie up NVIDIA. Like, so, it's don't you think that's a little confusing? You have like a guy that delivers 40,000 vehicles a year as an OEM, and you're going to basically throw $1.25 billion, 1.2 billion or 1.25 billion at this company. Like, doesn't that send mixed signals on kind of where NVIDIA is in the market?
I think there's a lot of mixed signals going on at Uber. As you and I alluded last week and said very bluntly, the press release machine, the printing press at Uber, is going on overdrive. The Rivian threw me for a loop because if you look at it, their sales are declining 14% year over year. And we're going to get into the fine print of the deal there. It seems to me that what's going on, because the R2, which they're going to use for the Robotaxi, has only done prototyping vehicles, no commercial sales yet. So what's going on? And not to mention, we don't have any update from VW on the winter testing. And why is the winter testing important? Because it unlocks $1 billion investment from VW into Rivian. We have no update on that. Because I bring that up because Rivian's cash flow and cash reserves are actively dwindling. And you and I know from experience, building autonomy is expensive.
It's surprising, I guess. But again, if you're Uber, you basically partner with everyone. And let's just break down some of the numbers. How many inspector hats am I going to be putting on during this podcast? This is literally part of my job. I shouldn't even have to be putting a hat on. I should be putting my analyst hat on. Look, the headline number was $1 billion, 1.25 billion. It's really $300 million up front, which is a typical size for the type of checks that Uber's been writing to new partners. And then to get the additional 950, there's 4 milestone payments that you're basically proving autonomy is going to work. And like, I don't know, it feels like Rivian's almost at a standing start. When you hear Jensen talk about autonomy, he's like, oh, we've been working on this for 10 years. And like, they've been, to your point, like looking to license technology. So I don't know how long Rivian's been working on this, but like all of a sudden they're going to just whip stuff out in the next couple of years. So obviously Uber's really putting 300 at risk as an equity payment, 4 milestone payments if they get autonomy to work. And then look, if it all works, they have and that's only for the 10,000 cars. I assume they have to pay for the 10,000 cars on top of the billion too, but who knows? Doesn't really matter. The next thing is the free option on the 40,000 cars. Even if everything goes well with Rivian, like we're 2 years from now, Rivian's gotten their $1.25 billion. But at that point, Uber's like, oh, I love Nuro. Nuro's doing great. Maybe we just buy Nuro. But they don't necessarily have to buy the 40,000. And let's say they like Rivian. They don't even have to buy them on their own. They can obviously have someone else buy them for them. And again, just to put the 300 million in perspective, this is like 0.2% of the enterprise value of Uber. It's less than 3% of the free cash flow. So 300 million, it's a nice number. It's validating, but it's like, okay, if you're Uber, you're placing your bets, you're making sure that the market knows that you're trying to develop alternatives, I think, to Waymo and Tesla. But it's not necessarily, doesn't, have the bang of like if they had gotten actually $1.3 billion, which really would have been helpful for all the reasons you just talked about if Rivian had that type of money right up front.
Do we know, is there any technology licensing agreements in this? And I ask that because Rivian is building their own chip, their own autonomous driving chip in partnership with Taiwan Semi. So you do a deal with NVIDIA, and then if you did a deal with Rivian, you're getting chip technology. So I have to ask that. Do we know, is there any technology licensing involved in this deal at all?
Most of the things in the 8K were redacted, just, coming up with those 4 milestone payment issues, which is frankly, not that advanced. Got the amount of likes and retweets I got on Twitter just from pulling out that very basic detail was enough. But none of this other stuff is typically reported. So look, obviously we want every autonomy company to succeed and get investment dollars to push it forward. Clearly, not every one of Uber's partners is gonna survive the next 5 years. The more it fragments, I think the tougher that gets. I mean, we can say that there's not exclusives with certain OEMs, but at the end of the day, how many tech stack partners does an OEM really want to take on? So a lot of interesting dynamics. I'm not sure how many more how many more tech stack companies out there are there, Grayson, for Uber to write a $300 million check to? Have they pretty much hit everyone at this point?
In terms of relationships, yes. In terms of investments, no. There is some obscure stuff in Europe and in Asia that they haven't dialed into yet, but I'll put it to you this way. They probably have 85 to 89% in terms of deals and or investments in the autonomy sector from a stack perspective.
I mean, if they write a $300 million check to pretty much every autonomy stack company, does that really count as being validating?
No. To me, it's level setting. You're just getting a seat at the table.
In any event, again, we look forward to that progress. Let's move on to the leader in the space, which is Waymo, who I actually kind of love this tweet. Normally, historically, we've seen kind of back and forth tweets between Waymo and Tesla and Uber, if they're about to announce something. Waymo just tweets out they completed 170 million fully autonomous miles through the end of the year and gave a breakdown on some of the markets.
37.87 million miles in Los Angeles, 53.52 in the San Francisco Bay Area, 68.61 million in the Phoenix region, and 10.72 million in Austin. The key to that, no safety drivers, fully autonomous. 170 million miles fully autonomous, no safety driver. Mic drop moment for Waymo.
I think it's subtle, but obviously it delivers the point. What else do we have in autonomy this week?
We're going to give you a few quick hits here. We had a photo on X shared by Neuro. Their test fleet with Lucid is roughly around 100 vehicles now, so that's progressing forward. And we saw at CES, and then when I visited Neuro a few weeks ago up close, that Gravity is a really great, nice-looking vehicle for rideshare. And then also Kodiak, our friends over there, the autonomous truck company, they opened a new lane, Dallas to El Paso. So 2 quick hits for you, but the market is continuing to churn both on the robotaxi side and on the trucking side.
And what about on the foreign autonomy desk?
The foreign autonomy desk, we ride's impressive. I got to tell you, they are in love with Europe, and they continue to expand in Europe. They expanded into Slovakia, which is their 4th European market, after France, Belgium, and Switzerland. Testing with safety drivers, have to point that out there, is going to begin in the first half of this year. And then Tokyo-based Tier 4, and the Tier 4 folks have been on the Road to Autonomy podcast, have began testing in Tokyo with the University of Tokyo. They've been testing in Munich with the Technical University of Munich, and in Pittsburgh with Carnegie Mellon, their new L4 open source autonomous driving stack. Again, with safety drivers, but the open source movement is continuing to evolve in autonomy.
Sounds like it's been busy. This week for WeRide, again, you mentioned about expanding to Slovakia. We're going to get an earnings report from them and Pony. Maybe I can get a question on the earnings call and ask them about their the ratio of their remote drivers to cars on the road. I know that was an issue we talked about in a prior podcast. What else do we have for next week, Grayson?
Next week, you and I are going cowboy. We're heading to Ford Fort Worth. Looking forward to moderating a panel there on the business of autonomous trucking. And then we're going to put our inspector hats on and go see what the great autonomy's doing in the great state of Texas.
Looking forward to it. Love the state of Texas. Hope I don't get tied up too much in these New York airports.
Good luck with your TSA lines. I've seen those lines, and oh boy, they look long. So good luck with that. We're going to have a great time in Texas. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is NVIDIA. Walt, until next week.